when you make a commitment to something, there is so much value in following through with that. And I was thinking about the, maybe at times, immeasurable cost of not following through with the promises you make to yourself.
Yeah.
And how it can seem like a novel idea on the surface for people to hear that. But there is such a hidden cost for betraying your promises to yourself. And, you know, I wonder, what's the neuroscience behind that? Like, what is it in our brain that when we betray our own trust has such a maybe unconscious but negative effect on our psyche?
Yeah. This is a great question. So what we're talking about here is the behavior continuation system. So you know how essentially in a very, very simplified way, you can say we operate the world in two ways. We've got emotional bursts, bottom up, we call them in neuroscience. And then we've got a top-down executive control where we control our impulses and our emotional bursts and so on. And that system has three different components. You probably remember that from your test results: behavior activation system, behavior inhibition system, and behavior continuation. And they are designed to, you know, get us to achieve greater things, achieve follow through when we set some goals, or inhibit some impulses that would be very stupid, you know, and we would regret later on. Or when we set a goal in January, that we follow through and pursue with the goal, pursue it even if the going gets hard, more than 3 months, you know. And these are very, very important learned skills. They are not hardwired. That's actually something you can learn and that you can foster, that very highly is a very good and strong predictor of life success, health, well-being, and so on. So that was a very long way of saying there's actually a behavior continuation system that you can measure, you know, how well you're doing with that. And if you do not manage to, you know, get some sort of behavior continuation, then you don't get that feeling of self-efficacy. So you can set a goal, but you don't get the reward that comes with actually achieving it and the satisfaction of, you know, I made that happen. And so that sense of self-efficacy is totally essential to a feeling of I can set goals in the world and I can achieve them. And so when people don't get that sense of self-efficacy, which tragically happens to people, then they kind of give up on the goal setting, or they give up on the goal pursuit. And the result is, you know, a lot of very unfavorable psychological effects. So I think 100% to feel that you can set goals and you can achieve them, and you do yourself the favor of actually following through with it, is so essential for feeling like you can create your own destiny and be somewhat in control of what's happening in your life.
There's two things I want to ask you on that. The first is, you mentioned you can actually measure that. How do you go about measuring that kind of thing?
Yeah. So it's part of the Deep Sphere assessment where, you know, we measure, there's certain questions that you can ask that measure the three different systems and the activation levels compared to the average population.
Okay. And what would you say if you looked at the blanket average population? I'm probably putting you on the spot here. But would you say that people have good behavioural continuation as a general?
Oh, this is a very interesting question. What would be good? You know, what is good? I think I don't have a universal answer for that. In general, you know, we find that people tend to be a couple of different groups. You know, there are people, and that correlates with your primary emotions, that find it very easy to get up and motivate themselves to pursue a certain goal, but they're not necessarily the people that find it easy to keep going. You know, people that get excited super quickly, but just as easily, you know, when it becomes a bit difficult and there's no immediate rewards in pursuing the goal, then they just drop the goal, move on to the next goal. So that's one very, very common pattern. And the other pattern is people with a very high inhibition. So they are much more focused on avoiding negative outcomes, avoiding, you know, danger and threats and so on. And so they will be very good at inhibiting impulses, but they inhibit too much, so they don't get up and get going. And then there are people who really have learned to apply grit to what they do. And this is 100% a learned skill, and you're not locked into that. You can always learn that. It's easier when you're younger, but you can always learn that also later in life, to just have had the experience that if they keep going, they can succeed. And that, of course, becomes a self-reinforcing feedback loop. Most people are somewhere in the middle, but people with a very, very high continuation, you do want to have them on your team.
So it's interesting you mentioned this, right? And this is, I guess, my second point to the question I wanted to ask, is I've heard Andrew Huberman talk about, I could butcher this because it's a very scientific term, but the anterior mid-cingulate cortex.
Yeah.
Yes. And essentially, I'll let you play the science role on this, but essentially the part of the brain that is activated by doing difficult things.
Yeah.
And I guess that has to be, the goalpost has to be moved on that consistently, because once you adapt to something, it is technically not difficult anymore.
That's right.
And I think about the value of that if I look at the experience of applying that to my own life. There was probably a higher sense of reward linked to, my first marathon prep than there has been in now Marathon Prep 5, because at the time there was a greater sense of difficulty and a greater resistance to doing the challenging stuff that now feels like I'm more adapted to and have a greater sense of confidence and competency towards. So for people who are listening and going, well, that all just sounded like very scientific and wish-washy from Brad, can you give them the more clinical answer to how that can be of value to them in their life?
Yeah, so essentially what he talked about there, that's the area in the brain, the anterior mid-cingulate cortex, that's responsible for tenacity, willpower, being able to lean into challenge, and being able to push through and get to a result, right? And I think what's interesting with that brain area, if we don't keep it challenged, then it actually atrophies. We actually get a diminished ability to have willpower, to have tenacity, to follow through, and to lead into challenge. And I think that is so interesting and poignant these days, where we're using technology more than ever to make our lives easy. Is it a good thing? You could argue, yeah, it's a great thing in some ways, because it frees me up to do the things I'm already passionate about, I'm already enjoying. But that's a slippery slope if you think that you might lose the tenacity and willpower to lean into challenging problems, to problem solve. That is a skill that's very, very valuable. And if we outsource all of that to ChatGPT and other algorithms, what are we left with?